My boss told me I was being groomed for promotion, then fired me out of nowhere. But the real twist? I was the secret owner of the company, and he had no idea. I can still picture the first day I walked into Fairview Industries, fresh out of college and absolutely clueless about the corporate world. Uncle Vince had pulled a few strings to get me in as a junior analyst. "This company is our family's foundation, Leo," he told me when he'd taken me out to lunch the week before. "Our pride. Don't forget that." Uncle Vince was never exactly affectionate, he was more like a mysterious benefactor. But still, I took his words to heart. The company was our legacy, and I was determined to work my way up and make him proud. A few months in, I was assigned to work under James Fallow, our chief operating officer. James was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with a full head of white hair and a smile that could make anyone feel like they mattered. "You're a smart kid, Leo," he said one evening as we walked out of the office late. "If you stick with me, I see big things in your future." He put a hand on my shoulder, giving me that look of fatherly approval that made my chest swell with pride. James had that easy charisma that made him seem trustworthy, like he was everyone's mentor, including mine. He started inviting me to weekly lunches, where he'd share all kinds of advice. "Listen, Leo," he'd say, "there's a difference between a good employee and a great one. Great employees anticipate, they're one step ahead. That's how you move up." I ate up every word. Uncle Vince might have been the one who got me in, but James made me feel like I belonged. Over the years, James became my biggest supporter, at least in my eyes. Whenever there was a big meeting, he'd say, "Take notes, Leo. Pay attention. You're going to be running these one day." It was exhilarating, hearing that kind of encouragement from someone in his position, and the longer I worked with him, the more I thought of him as a kind of father figure. He even introduced me to his wife and kids at the company Christmas party one year. "Dad talks about you all the time," his daughter Lydia said with a laugh. "We practically know you already." I was floored. To think he talked about me with his family, it felt like I was finally, fully accepted. I thought I was on the fast track to a director role, maybe even higher if I played my cards right. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was at my desk when James called me into his office. I thought it was just another meeting, maybe we were going to talk strategy for the upcoming quarter. But when I walked in, the atmosphere was different. His usual warmth was gone, replaced with a kind of icy detachment I'd never seen from him. "Leo, close the door," he said, without looking up. I hesitated for a second but did as he asked. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep the edge of worry out of my voice. James cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. "There's no easy way to say this, Leo," he began, leaning back in his chair and looking somewhere past me. "But the company's been facing some tough times. We've had to make a lot of hard decisions recently." I felt a cold sweat prickling down my back. "Hard decisions?" I repeated, trying to mask my panic. "Leo, we're restructuring the team, and unfortunately, your position has been deemed non-essential." He paused, his gaze finally meeting mine with a look that was almost regretful. "Effective immediately, you're terminated." For a second, I was sure I'd misheard him. "Wait, terminated?" I stammered. "James, I've been here for years. You said I was on track for a promotion." He sighed, rubbing his temples as if he was doing me a favor by even having this conversation. "I know, Leo, I know. But sometimes things don't work out the way we hope. This isn't personal, it's just business. The board and I had to make a call." "But, what about everything we talked about? You said I was a rising star. You told me to stick with you, that I was being groomed for bigger things," I argued, my voice cracking with a mixture of anger and desperation. James looked away, sighing. "Plans change, Leo. I have to think about what's best for the company as a whole." The finality in his tone was like a punch to the gut. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just like that?" James gave me a small, insincere smile, the kind people use when they're trying to placate a child. "You're a talented guy, Leo. You'll land on your feet." I walked out of that office feeling like my entire life had been a lie. As I packed up my desk, I felt eyes on me, colleagues who'd been my friends, people I'd confided in over the years. Some looked sympathetic, but most just avoided eye contact, too afraid to be associated with someone on their way out. Months passed, and I tried to piece my life back together. Consulting gigs here and there, freelance work that barely covered my expenses. Uncle Vince refused to speak with me, he'd been distant ever since I was fired, which only deepened my frustration. I left messages, sent emails, even dropped by his house once, but his wife answered the door and told me he was busy. It wasn't until 2 years later, out of the blue, that I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Leo?" A weak voice croaked. "It's Uncle Vince." My stomach dropped. "Uncle Vince? Are you okay?" "I need you to come to Mercy Hospital," he said, his voice strained. "There's something you need to know, about James. About why he did what he did." I felt my pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Just, come. Please. When I got to the hospital, the sight of Uncle Vince shocked me. He was frail, thinner than I'd ever seen him, with tubes and monitors surrounding him. His face was pale, almost ghostly. He beckoned me closer, his hand trembling as he gestured for me to sit beside him. Leo, I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. Telling me what? I asked, leaning in. What did James do? A deep sigh escaped him. When your father passed, he left something behind. A clause in his will, tying his shares in Fairview to his oldest son. That's you, Leo. The day you turned 30, the ownership of those shares would pass to you. But James found out. I blinked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Wait, what? Are you telling me, Fairview was supposed to be mine? Uncle Vince nodded weakly. I was supposed to tell you, but James convinced me to keep quiet. He said you weren't ready, that it would ruin your career. He promised he'd groom you to take over if I just let him handle things. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. But then, when he realized that you'd find out soon enough, he cut you off. Fired you. He thought if you were out of the picture, you wouldn't be able to stake any claim. I stared at him in disbelief, anger bubbling up inside me. So he threw me out of my own company? And you just let him? Vince's eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, Leo. I thought he'd follow through, that he'd honor his word. He coughed, his voice rasping. I was wrong. And now, with everything I know, I can't stay silent. I sat there, numb, as the weight of his confession sank in. James, the man I'd trusted like a mentor, like family, had betrayed me, stolen everything that was rightfully mine. And all this time, Uncle Vince had kept silent, watching it happen. The next few weeks were a blur. I couldn't shake the anger, the betrayal. My days were spent obsessing over every detail, replaying every conversation with James, realizing how he'd manipulated me with his promises. But instead of rushing to confront him, I decided I needed a plan. I started digging, reaching out to former employees, trying to find any shred of evidence that could prove what Vince had told me. It wasn't easy. James was careful, almost paranoid. But he'd made enemies over the years, people who were willing to talk, people who'd seen glimpses of the man behind the mask. Finally, I gathered enough information to go to a lawyer, challenging James's ownership and asserting my rightful claim over the company. It was the start of a long, exhausting legal battle, but I wasn't going to back down. Every time I faced James in the boardroom or the courtroom, I could see the fury in his eyes, the silent threat simmering beneath his composed exterior. But he had no idea how far I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about redemption. About proving that I wasn't the naive kid he'd tried to cast aside. And as the battle wore on, I could feel the scales tipping in my favor. But this was only the beginning. I knew that my fight with James wouldn't end easily. And in the shadows, I had to wonder, what else was he hiding? What other secrets lay buried beneath the surface, waiting to come to light? The story continues, the stage set for an explosive climax as Leo's journey toward truth and justice collides with the darker secrets that lie within the company and James's ruthless determination. Months of grueling legal battles turned into over a year. James fought tooth and nail to keep his position, hiring top-tier attorneys and trying every tactic to throw out my claim. He'd glare across the courtroom with a smug half-smile, clearly thinking he'd wear me down. But he underestimated my resolve. Every piece of evidence, every recorded meeting, every email and affidavit added to the mountain of proof. It became clear, even to the judge, that James had manipulated the system to oust me, all while pretending to be my mentor. By this point, I'd amassed undeniable evidence. I had witnesses, people who had been complicit in James's schemes but were now willing to testify against him to save themselves. The judge finally ruled in my favor. Not only was I the rightful heir to the shares, but the court found that James had committed multiple breaches of fiduciary duty. When the ruling was read out, James went pale, his smugness melting into pure, unfiltered rage. But my satisfaction didn't end there. It was time to confront him, face to face, outside of the courtroom's formality. The next morning, I marched into the headquarters of Fairview Industries, where James had held the throne for so long. The company board had demanded a meeting with him, and I knew this was my moment. When I entered the boardroom, James was already there, sitting rigidly in his chair, his eyes fixed on me like a hawk. The board members sat silently, watching the tension unfold. Leo, James sneered, barely hiding his contempt. So, this is how you think you'll handle things? A kid playing pretend CEO? I sat across from him, matching his cold glare. I wouldn't be so confident if I were you, James. The board already knows what you've done. His eyes flickered with a hint of fear, but he quickly masked it. You think you've won? You wouldn't know the first thing about running this company. I chuckled, leaning back in my chair. Oh, don't worry, James. I'm not just here to take your seat. I'm here to make sure everyone knows what you've done. At that, I turned to the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I've filed charges against James for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and embezzlement. For years, he's been funneling company funds into shell accounts and siphoning off profits. The silence was thick. James's face was turning red, and he jumped to his feet. That's absurd. You have no proof. But I did. With a nod, I gestured to my attorney, who stepped forward with a dossier packed with documentation. I'd traced every dollar he'd stolen, every fraudulent account he'd set up. The board members flipped through the pages, their expressions turning from shock to disgust. One of them, Margaret, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd been with the company for decades, glared at James. James, this is criminal. How could you do this to Fairview? James stammered, trying to regain his footing. This is all exaggerated. A misunderstanding. He's trying to ruin me. I let him rant, watching him unravel. But then I added the final nail in his coffin. Actually, James, I have recordings of conversations between you and certain associates of yours. You know, the ones who helped you cover up your tracks? They were more than willing to talk once they realized you'd thrown them under the bus. The color drained from his face. He'd played a game for years, manipulating people to keep himself untouchable. But now, every lie, every betrayal was crashing down on him. With nothing left to defend himself, James resorted to desperation. Leo, he hissed, don't do this. We can work something out. You wanted a promotion, didn't you? Let's talk. I can make things right for you. Give you what you deserve. I shook my head, almost pitying him. I think you're mistaken, James. I don't want your pity or your position. I want justice. I gestured to security, who were waiting by the door. You're done here. The guards approached, and James lurched forward, reaching out to me in a last, pathetic attempt. Leo, wait, this company won't survive without me. You're making a huge mistake. But I simply watched as the guards escorted him out, his cries echoing down the hallway. For the first time in years, the weight lifted off my shoulders. Fairview was finally free of him. In the weeks that followed, I took over as the acting CEO, but I was careful about one thing: transparency. I met with every department, sat with employees who had worked under James's shadow for years, and made it clear that we were entering a new era. One afternoon, as I was going over paperwork in the boardroom, Margaret knocked on the door and stepped inside. Leo, she said, giving me a rare smile. I wanted to thank you. Fairview has needed this change for a long time. I think you're the right man for the job. Her words were a relief. Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to do my best to make this place something my family would be proud of. And I did. Over the following months, I worked day and night, rebuilding trust, ensuring our accounts were clean, and putting the company back on track. James had left a mess, but I wasn't afraid of the hard work. One day, as I was leaving the office, I got a call from my attorney. Leo, he said, sounding particularly pleased, thought you'd like to know, James just accepted a plea deal. He's going to serve time for embezzlement and fraud. I let out a long breath, feeling the last shred of tension release. Justice had finally been served. That night, I visited my father's grave for the first time in years. I knelt down, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, and whispered, I did it, Dad. The company is ours again. As I stood up and looked back at Fairview's shining building across the Milwaukee skyline, I knew that I'd reclaimed not just my family's legacy, but my own sense of worth. I had faced down betrayal, rebuilt from ruin, and found my way back to where I belonged. And as for James? Well, karma had a way of coming full circle.